Hey everyone, thanks for tuning in. If you're new here, consider subscribing. It really helps keep these stories coming. And while you're here, let me know in the comments where you're listening from. Now, sit back, relax, and let's get into the story. I did not pick the bell tower because it was holy or romantic or because I thought it would save me. I picked it because it was tall, made of stone, and it had only one way up. That is how my brain was working by the time I reached the edge of town. Angles, weight, noise, and distance. Not beliefs, not wishes. Just the simple math of staying unseen. The town was real. It sat in the Appalachian foothills where two-lane roads folded around creeks and old brick storefronts. I had passed through it years earlier for a work job, when life was normal enough that my biggest problem was whether my hotel had a working ice machine. I remembered a courthouse, a small square, and a church that sat on the highest rise like it had been placed there to watch traffic. Now the roads were empty, but not quiet. Wind moved loose signs. A window shade slapped inside a second-floor apartment. A chain-link fence gate swung and clanked on a broken hinge until it tired itself out and hung still again. No cars ran. No voices carried. The only living movement came from the infected. They drifted in and out of the square at irregular hours. Some moved as single figures, heads down, shoulders forward, steps uneven like they were following a sound only they could hear. Others moved in loose groups, drawn together by noise and then breaking apart when the noise ended. They bumped into things and stopped. They leaned against walls until something changed in the air and they started moving again. I watched from behind a hedgerow for almost an hour before I took a single step towards the church. I am not the kind of person who claims he always knew how to survive. I had no bunker and no heroic plan. I had a skill set that fit the new world by accident. I knew structures, I knew systems, and I knew how quickly small mistakes became big failures. Before everything collapsed, I was a field engineer for a company that serviced communication towers and emergency radio sites. My work was half climbing and half troubleshooting. When a county radio site went down, when a microwave link fell out of alignment, when a backup generator threw an alarm, I was the one sent out with a truck, a laptop, a multimeter, and a stack of paperwork orders. I spent years driving between small towns like this one. The job taught me something I did not fully appreciate until the outbreak. Height is safety, but only if you can control access. Height is also exposure. Height is also loneliness. And height will betray you if you get careless with sound. I waited until the infected moved away from the church steps and drifted toward the center of the square, drawn by a loose piece of sheet metal that was clattering against a downspout in the wind. When they turned their bodies toward it, I moved. I kept my pack tight to my spine. I carried a short pry bar in my right hand and a compact flashlight in my left, taped to my fingers so it would not slip if I had to grab something fast. I moved in the shallow shadows next to buildings, stepping on bare dirt when I could, avoiding glass, avoiding dry leaves, avoiding anything that made the crisp crackle sound that carried. The church had been hit early, like many places. Not because anyone targeted it, but because people ran toward the familiar buildings when fear hit. Churches, schools, fire stations, anywhere with a big door and the idea of safety behind it. The main sanctuary doors were splintered outward, which told me people had forced their way out, not in. The stained glass windows were gone. In their place were jagged leaded frames and rough plywood nailed over holes, some of it torn away. The roofline sagged in the center where the wooden trusses had burned and collapsed. Rain had been working on the interior ever since. But the bell tower was a different structure. It was stone, likely built in the late 1900s or earlier, and it was shaped like a square column with narrow slit windows and thick corner buttresses. Even if the rest of the building failed, the tower could remain standing, like a chimney after a fire. I circled the building once. I looked for fresh tracks in mud. I looked for trash that smelled like food. I looked for any sign someone had been coming and going recently. I saw old footprints, softened by rain and time. I saw a plastic bottle with a faded label half buried near the steps. I saw a collapsed section of gutter and a downed tree branch. Nothing new. The tower entrance was on the north side, set into the stone with a heavy wooden door that had once been painted a deep red. The paint was gone in places, the wood split by weather. The door hung at a slight angle. The lock plate was bent. Someone had forced it years ago. I held still and listened. No movement inside, no breathing, no soft scrape of a shoe, only the slow whistle of wind through broken windows. I eased the door open without letting it scrape. The stairwell inside was tight and smelled like damp stone, mouse droppings, and old wood. A narrow staircase spiraled upward around a central void. The steps were stone at the bottom, transitioning to wood after the first landing. The wooden steps were dark from moisture and worn in the center by decades of feet. I did not go up immediately. I stayed in the doorway and looked at the base of the stair like it was a crime scene. I was looking for fresh scuffs, new dust disturbance, any sign that someone had moved through recently. The dust was uniform. Cobwebs hung across corners undisturbed. That was good. I stepped inside, pulled the door closed, and placed my pry bar between the door and the jamb. Not to seal it, but to prevent the wind from pushing it open and letting it bang. Noise was the enemy. Then I started climbing. I went slow, testing each step with my weight before committing. I did not trust any wood that had been wet for months. I kept my shoulder lightly against the stone wall for balance. Every 10 steps I stopped, listened, and let my breathing settle. The first landing held a small room that might have been storage. There were rotted hymn books in a cardboard box, a broken broom handle, old string lights that had once been wrapped around the tower for a holiday service. The wiring was brittle and useless now, but I still took it. Wire, even dead wire, is never worthless. Another flight up, and I reached a second landing with a narrow window looking out over the churchyard. The glass was gone, replaced by a jagged frame. From here, I could see the cemetery behind the church. Rows of gray stones, some leaning, some broken. Beyond that, a strip of woods and a back road that led out of town. It was a good sight line, but I did not stop there. I climbed until the staircase ended at a heavy wooden hatch that opened into the bell chamber. I pushed it gently, and it squealed anyway, a long dry complaint from the hinge. The sound made my stomach tighten. I froze and waited. The squeal echoed up the stone shaft and out through cracks. It was not loud like a gunshot, but it was sharp, unnatural, the kind of noise that made the infected turn their heads. I stood still for a full minute, listening for footsteps downstairs, listening for any movement outside. Nothing. I pushed the hatch open another inch, this time holding the hinge side with my fingers to keep it from vibrating. I pulled a small bottle of oil from my pack. It was not special oil. It was a general lubricant I had kept in my truck for squeaky bolts and stuck latches. I had taken it when I abandoned my vehicle. I tilted it, let a few drops run into the hinge pin. Then I opened the hatch fully. The bell chamber smelled like old birds and wet wood. Pigeon feathers and droppings layered the corners. The bell itself hung from a wooden frame, a heavy bronze shape that looked both ancient and indifferent. The rope that had once rung it had been cut, leaving a frayed end tied around a beam. I moved to the far wall and looked out through a long opening where wooden louvers had been torn away. The view stretched across the entire town. The square, the courthouse, the main street, the gas station at the edge, and the tree line beyond. The tower gave me what I needed most: information. In the New World, information was food and water and armor all at once. If you could see what was coming, you could avoid it. If you could see patterns, you could plan. If you could watch without being watched, you could survive longer than the people who ran blind. The problem was staying unseen up here. I moved into the shadows of the chamber and took my pack off. Then I began the work that would keep me alive, turning a ruined bell tower into a hidden shelter that would not advertise itself. The first thing I did was manage sound. Loose boards vibrate, loose metal rings. Hard objects slide and tap. In a tower, even a small noise can carry down the stone like a funnel. I gathered debris and sorted it by usefulness. Broken pew fragments, which were hardwood and still strong in places, went in one pile. Rotten softwood went in another. Rusted nails went in a tin I found in the corner. I did not toss anything. I placed everything. Then I checked the floor. The bell chamber floor was wooden, supported by heavy beams embedded into the stone. There was water staining near one wall where rain came through cracks. I took my flashlight and inspected each beam end where it disappeared into the masonry. I looked for soft wood, for black rot, for insect damage. Most of it was dry enough. The tower had leaks, but it was not soaked through. I stepped near the center and bounced slightly on my heels, feeling for flex. There was some, but not much. That told me the structure still had stiffness. The beams were still doing their job. Still, I chose my sleeping platform location carefully. I wanted it along the strongest line, close to a wall where the beams were supported. I used pew fragments as joists, laying them across two solid beams. I used smaller pieces as cross-bracing. I bound joints with stripped wire and a few screws I carried in a small plastic organizer. I did not have a power drill anymore, but I had a manual screwdriver and patience. I built a platform big enough for one person to lie flat, not wide enough for someone else to share without being uncomfortable. I wanted it that way. Comfort invites guests. Guests bring noise. Once the platform was set, I laid down a sleeping pad salvaged from a sporting goods store weeks earlier and a thin wool blanket that had belonged to my father. The blanket smelled faintly like old detergent and home. I did not let myself think about that too long. Next came the staircase. The tower's staircase was my choke point. One way up meant one way to defend, but it also meant I could be trapped if someone got past my barriers. I went down 2 landings and studied the stairwell geometry. The wooden portion was the weak point. If someone forced their way up fast, I needed obstacles that slowed them without making loud noises themselves. I used a door from a broken storage closet on the first landing. I wedged it across the stairwell at a slight angle, creating a narrowed gap that required turning sideways. I did not block it completely. I needed to move through without climbing, especially in the dark. I reinforced the wedge points with wooden blocks, and I tied the whole assembly to a stair post with wire so it could not be kicked loose easily. On the next landing, I placed a second barrier, a cluster of pew fragments arranged like a leaning lattice. It looked like debris, but it was deliberate. It forced someone to step high and awkwardly, putting weight on unstable surfaces. If they rushed, they would stumble. If they stumbled, they would make noise. If they made noise, I would have warning. I added a simple early warning system too, but I kept it subtle. A length of thin wire stretched across the stairwell at knee height, attached to a small metal washer that would rattle against a tin can if disturbed. Not a loud alarm, but a small mechanical whisper that would reach me when the tower was otherwise silent. I did not invent that system. People have been doing variations of it for centuries. The key was not making it obvious. The key was not making it dangerous to me when I moved through in the dark. After that, I addressed the tower's biggest weakness: water and wind. Rain leaked through cracked masonry, especially on the side facing the prevailing weather. Wind pushed through openings where louvers had been ripped away. In winter, it would be brutal. In storms, it would be chaotic. I could not fix masonry properly without mortar and tools, but I could manage the interior environment. I hung pieces of heavy fabric I'd collected from abandoned houses, curtains, bed sheets, a section of thick canvas, from nails driven into beams. I created a partial inner wall that blocked direct wind and trapped a warmer pocket of air near my sleeping platform. I left gaps at the top for ventilation. A sealed tower would be a moisture trap, and moisture would ruin everything: clothes, food, electronics, and lungs. I set up a rain catch system using a plastic tarp and a cut piece of gutter. I anchored the tarp to the wall using screws and fender washers so it would not tear under tension. I sloped it toward the gutter piece and directed that into a 5-gallon bucket. 5 gallons is not much, but water is heavy. 1 gallon weighs about 8 1/3 pounds. Carrying water up a tower staircase is work. Catching it in place is survival. I filtered everything I drank. I had a small gravity filter bag in my pack, the kind sold to hikers. I had also scavenged plain household bleach weeks earlier, unscented, and kept it in a small dropper bottle. I did not rely on just one method. Filtering removed particles and most organisms. A small dose of disinfectant added a second barrier. In a world without hospitals, stomach illness could take you down as surely as teeth. My power was simple: batteries. I had a small folding solar panel about the size of a notebook when packed. I could hang it near the opening during clear hours and charge a battery bank that held enough energy to run a small radio, charge my flashlight, and top off a phone I kept powered down most of the time. I did not have service on the phone. That was not why I kept it. Maps, notes, photos, a clock, a flashlight backup, a device that carried pieces of my old life in a rectangle of glass. I also had a handheld radio receiver, the kind that can scan weather broadcasts and public safety channels. Before the collapse, it would have been illegal for me to transmit on certain frequencies without authorization. Now, legality was not the point, but I still did not transmit unless I had to. Transmitting is a beacon. Listening is safety. Every morning, I ran a routine. I woke with the first gray light. I checked my water bucket. I checked my barriers by feeling the tension on each tie wire, listening for any new looseness. I looked out over the town and counted infected. Counting sounds pointless until you have to decide whether to risk leaving for supplies. Some days there were 20 in the square. Some days there were 50. Sometimes there were none. And those days were the worst, because it meant they were somewhere else, drawn by something I could not see. I kept a notebook, pencil only. Ink freezes and leaks, pencil stays. I marked weather, wind direction, infected movement patterns, and any human signs: smoke, tracks, light at night, any noise that did not fit the normal creak of an empty town. After the morning scan, I ate. Food was simple: canned beans, crackers, peanut butter, whatever I could find that would not spoil. I was careful with waste. In a tower, waste management matters, not because it is unpleasant, but because it draws animals, and animals draw infected, and smell draws people. I used a sealed bucket lined with heavy trash bags, and I kept a separate container for liquid waste that I emptied down a deep storm drain on the far side of the churchyard when I could do so safely. I never dumped anything directly near the church. I did not want a scent trail leading to my tower. Living up high kept me away from infected hands, but it introduced other threats. Lightning, for one. A stone tower is not a metal tower, but it can still conduct, and it still sits as the tallest object around. During storms, I stayed away from the openings and did not touch the bell frame or any metal hardware. Cold was another. Wind chill up there was real. In winter, you burn calories just staying warm. I wore layers. I used a small backpacking stove only when I had to, and when I did, I used it near an opening with airflow and never for long. Smoke and smell can travel farther than you think, and fire indoors is a risk I did not take lightly. The last threat was people. People were not automatically dangerous, but they were unpredictable. Infected followed simple rules: noise, movement, proximity. People had motives. The first week in the tower, I saw no one living. The second week, I saw signs. A distant column of smoke one morning, thin and gray, rising from beyond the north ridge. It was too steady to be a car fire. It was a cooking fire or a warming fire controlled. That meant someone was alive within a few miles. 2 days later, I found fresh boot prints near the back road cemetery entrance. They were deep, made in damp soil after rain. They led toward town and then disappeared onto pavement. I did not follow them. Following other people's trails is how you walk into their problems. Instead, I stayed still and watched. That night, I heard shouting. It started just after dusk, when the sky was still a little blue and streetlights, long dead, should have been turning on. It came from the direction of the town's main street near a row of small businesses. A man's voice, loud and angry. Another voice, higher, frightened. Then a crash, like a door being kicked. The infected reacted immediately. Even from the tower, I could see them turning their heads as if pulled by a string. They started moving toward the noise in that loose, lurching way. The shouting continued for less than a minute, then cut off abruptly. After that, there was only the sound of infected feet on pavement, a dry shuffle that carried in the still air. I stayed back from the opening and watched from shadow. I saw 3 living people run into the square, sprinting hard. They carried packs. One carried something long and dark in his hands, likely a rifle. They were moving fast, but they were moving in the open, and their footsteps echoed. They headed straight for the church. My church. The church doors hung open, and they disappeared into the sanctuary like it was the most obvious refuge in town. I did not move. I did not yell. I did not make any sound that would mark my position. I watched the infected stream after them like water finding a low place. At first, the survivors were smart. They pulled the sanctuary doors shut. I saw the doors move, saw the gap narrow. They likely thought the old wood would hold. Old wood does not hold against enough pressure. The infected slammed into the doors in a wave. The noise echoed up the tower walls and vibrated through my feet. I backed away from the bell. I pressed my palm to the stone and felt the structure take the vibrations. The tower was stiff enough that it did not sway, but sound traveled. I knew then that my tower was not as isolated as it felt. The tower was connected to the chaos below like a drum. The survivors inside the church shouted. I could not hear words clearly, but I heard panic. I heard the rise in pitch that told me they were losing control. I forced myself to stay still, to stay quiet, to let the situation play out without my involvement. That is an ugly thing to admit, but it is the truth. If they discovered I was in the tower, they would come up. They would want shelter. They would want access. They would want partnership. And partnership sounds noble until you realize it is a constant negotiation over food, water, noise, and risk. And if they got chased up here, the tower would become a trap. I watched the sanctuary doors buckle. I watched one hinge tear free. The doors blew inward under the pressure, and infected poured into the church like a breach in a dam. The shouting turned into screaming. I heard a woman, I heard a man yelling for someone to move. Then I heard gunfire. Sharp cracks that punched through the air and echoed off the courthouse and storefronts. Each shot drew more infected from side streets and alleyways. The noise was like ringing a dinner bell across town. The gunfire lasted maybe 15 seconds, then stopped. After that, there were only infected sounds. Foot shuffles, low vocalizations, and the crash of something heavy knocked over inside. I crouched in the shadow of the bell chamber, gripping my pry bar until my fingers hurt. I wanted to help. That impulse is real. It does not go away just because the world is broken. But I also knew that help could cost me the tower, and the tower was the only reason I was alive at that moment. The infected stayed in the church for a long time. They came out in ones and twos eventually, drifting away as the noise died. The square filled again, then emptied, then filled. I watched until full dark. When I finally slept, it was shallow sleep. Every small sound made my eyes snap open. The next morning, I waited for daylight and movement. No movement came from the church. I forced myself to stay in the tower all day. I ate little, I drank little, I watched the square. That afternoon, something changed. I heard a small, careful sound from inside the church, not a crash or shout, but the kind of sound made by someone trying not to be heard. A soft scrape. A shift. Someone was alive down there. My first reaction was fear. My second reaction was anger at myself for feeling fear before anything else. I waited until the square was mostly empty, until only a handful of infected lingered in the shade of the courthouse. Then I moved. I descended the tower slowly, stopping at each landing to listen. My barriers were undisturbed. The wire alarm had not rattled. That meant no one had tried to climb. At the base, I cracked the tower door and looked out. The churchyard was empty. The cemetery beyond was empty. Wind moved through dead grass. I stepped out, stayed close to the tower wall, and moved along the church's exterior toward a side entrance where a small door led into what had once been a maintenance area. That door was half open. I pushed it an inch and listened. Inside, I heard breathing. Controlled, shallow breathing, like someone trying to stay quiet while their body insisted on being alive. I spoke softly, not a whisper, because whispers carry in strange ways and often sound like hissing. I used a low, normal voice. "Hey, if you can hear me, I am outside, I am not infected." Silence. Then a voice, weak, female. "Please, do not come in." That sentence hit me harder than any scream. Do not come in. Not help me. Not who are you. Just a boundary, spoken by someone who knew that anyone could be a threat. "I am not coming in," I said. "I just want to know if you need water." A pause, then, "Yes." "Are you alone?" "No." "How many?" "2." I swallowed. 2 survivors from that group of 3. That meant 1 was gone. I did not say it out loud. "I can leave a bottle by the door," I said. "You can take it after I step away." Another pause. Then, "Okay." I pulled a plastic bottle from my pack and set it on the ground just inside the doorway, then stepped back around the corner so they would not have to see me. I waited with my back to the wall, watching the square and listening. A minute passed. 2. Then I heard the softest shuffle and the bottle scrape. The door moved slightly, then closed again. I stayed still for another full minute. Then I spoke again. "If you need to leave, do it when the square is empty. If you need a safe place, there is nothing safe here." It was not entirely true, but it was close enough. The voice spoke again, quieter now. "Where are you staying?" I did not answer. A silence was a choice. I hated myself for it, but I did not answer. I walked back to the tower and climbed to my bell chamber. From above, I watched the church for the rest of the day. Near evening, the side door opened a crack, and a figure slipped out. A woman, thin, hair pulled back, moving like her legs were sore. She looked around, then motioned. A second figure appeared, a boy, maybe 10 or 11, wearing a backpack that looked too big for him. He held his arms close to his body, as if cold even in daylight. They moved along the church wall and into the cemetery, staying low behind gravestones, using them as cover the way soldiers use barriers, except these were carved stones with names and dates. They disappeared into the woods behind the church. I did not follow. I stayed in the tower and tried not to think about them. That night I heard a different kind of noise. Not shouting, not gunfire, but a car horn, far away, blaring in short bursts. It echoed across town, bounced off buildings. The infected reacted as expected. They moved toward it, drawn like iron filings. The horn sounded again, closer, then stopped. Then I saw light. A flashlight beam sweeping near the gas station at the edge of town. Someone was moving with intent. Not drifting, not wandering, working. I watched from the tower, heart pounding, and I realized something that made my stomach drop. The woman and boy had not left town. They had gone into the woods to hide until night. Now they were moving again, using the horn to pull infected away from their path. It was smart. It was also loud. It was also dangerous. I watched the infected shift like a tide. They moved toward the gas station, away from the square, away from the church. The woman and boy moved along the back road, staying in darkness, staying near fences and trees. They were heading toward the North Ridge, toward the smoke I had seen days earlier. They had a destination, and they were doing it without a third person. I knew then that they were not just survivors. They were survivors with loss. Loss makes people either reckless or careful. Their movement told me which. I made a decision that I had been avoiding for weeks. I would leave the tower. Not because it was failing structurally, not because it was discovered, but because staying invisible forever is not the same as living. Also, the tower could not feed me indefinitely. My supplies were shrinking. My scavenging runs were getting riskier as food in easy locations disappeared. If there was a group on the ridge, if there was a functioning camp, my chances increased. But joining a group meant a risk I could not control. I spent the next day preparing. I packed only what mattered: water filter, disinfectant, radio, battery bank, solar panel, flashlight, spare batteries, pry bar, a small first aid kit, and as much food as I could carry without slowing myself. I also carried a weapon, because pretending you can survive without one is a fantasy. I had a 9mm pistol with 2 magazines, scavenged from a sheriff's deputy months earlier when I found his abandoned cruiser and his duty belt lying on the pavement beside it. I did not take it from a living person. I did not want that on my conscience. I also carried a small hatchet, not as a weapon, but as a tool. In the world I now lived in, tools mattered more than anything. If you could cut wood, you could build. If you could build, you could survive weather. Weather does not care about courage. I did not plan to use either weapon unless I had to. I did not want noise. I did not want attention. That evening, when the square emptied again and the wind shifted to cover my sound, I descended the tower and left the church behind. I moved through the cemetery and into the woods. The trees behind the church were mixed hardwoods, bare branches in winter, thick shade in summer. The ground was uneven, with exposed roots and old stone walls that marked property lines from a time when people farmed every hill. I followed the general direction the woman and boy had taken, but I did not follow their exact trail. I stayed parallel, far enough away that if they had left a lookout, I would not walk into it. I moved for 2 hours, stopping often to listen. At one point, I heard infected in the woods, moving without urgency, just drifting. I crouched behind a fallen log and waited until they passed. At another point, I heard a dog barking in the distance, then yelping, then going silent. I forced myself not to imagine details. In the new world, imagination can trap you. Near midnight, I saw the first sign of the ridge camp. A faint light, shielded, not visible from afar unless you were in the right angle. Then I smelled smoke again, but not heavy smoke. Controlled smoke, the kind from a small stove or a well-managed fire. I slowed to a crawl. I approached the ridge like I approached the tower, as a problem to solve, not a hope to chase. I found a vantage point behind rocks and looked down into a small clearing. There were tents. Not new ones, but repaired ones. There were tarps strung between trees. There was a low structure made from salvaged lumber and corrugated metal, likely a kitchen or storage area. There were 2 vehicles, both parked under camouflage netting. One looked like an old pickup, the other like a sport utility vehicle. And there were people. At least 8, maybe 10, moving with purpose. One stood watch near the edge of the clearing with a long gun slung across his chest. Another carried water from a collection point. Another was chopping wood. They were not panicking, they were working. That did not mean they were safe. It meant they were organized. Organized groups can be welcoming or dangerous, sometimes both. I waited and watched until I saw the woman and boy. They entered the clearing from the far side, and someone immediately met them. A man, tall, wearing a reflective safety vest over a jacket, like he had grabbed it from a road crew truck and kept it because bright colors still meant authority in his mind. He put a hand on the boy's shoulder, guided him toward the central shelter. The woman spoke quickly, pointing back toward town. The man nodded, then gestured to others. 2 people moved to the watch position. Someone else brought the woman a cup. They were reacting to information, not just presence. That mattered. I did not walk in. I announced myself from the edge of the clearing, loud enough to be heard, calm enough not to sound like a threat. "Hey, I am alone. I am not infected. I am coming in slow." Every head turned. The watchman lifted his rifle, not pointing it directly, but ready. Someone shouted, "Stop right there!" I stopped. I held my hands out to the sides, palms open. My pistol was holstered under my jacket, but I did not reach for it. Reaching is how misunderstandings turn final. "My name is Aaron," I said. "I've been staying in a bell tower in town. I saw your smoke. I came to see if you were taking people." The watchman's voice came again, sharper. "Any bites?" "No," I said. "No injuries. I have supplies. Not much." The man in the reflective vest stepped forward into the dim light. He was older than me, maybe in his 50s, with a shaved head and a face that had learned to say no for a living. "What do you do?" he asked. That question was not small talk. In the new world, your value was your skills. Your story mattered less than your utility. "I was a field engineer," I said. "Communications towers. Backup power systems. I can troubleshoot radios, battery systems, generators. I can build and reinforce structures." He studied me for a long moment. Then he said, "We already got a radio guy." I nodded. "Then you do not need me." I started to step back and he raised a hand. "Hold on," he said. "I did not say that. I said we got one. That does not mean we got enough." He looked toward the woman and boy. The woman was watching me with tired eyes, her posture defensive, like she expected disappointment. The man in the vest said, "You saw them in town?" I understood what he meant. "Yes," I said. "They hid in the church. I left water. I watched them move. They did it smart." The woman's shoulders dropped slightly. Not fully, but enough to show she was listening. The man nodded again. "I am Daryl," he said. "I ran highway maintenance for the county before all this. We call this Ridge Camp. If you want in, there are rules." "Okay," I said. "No noise after dark," he said. "No wandering off without telling someone. Work earns food. If you bring trouble here, you do not stay." "Okay," I said again. He pointed to a spot near the edge of the clearing. "Put your pack down there and step back." I did it. Someone approached my pack and searched it while I stood 10 feet away, hands still visible. They found my water filter, my solar panel, my radio receiver. They found my pistol and my spare magazines. The person searching paused, looked at Daryl. Daryl nodded once. "Everybody carries." The searcher zipped the pack back up. Daryl gestured me forward. As I walked into the clearing, I felt something I had not felt in weeks. Not relief, tension. Because being alone is lonely, but it is simple. Being with people is complicated. They brought me to a small shelter made of 2x4 lumber and plywood, lined with tarps to block wind. Inside, a propane heater sat on the ground, the kind used on job sites. It was vented awkwardly through a gap in the wall, and I immediately saw the problem. Condensation, soot staining, poor airflow. I did not comment right away. I was still a guest. They gave me water. They gave me a bowl of rice and canned meat, warmed. I ate slowly, watching faces. The woman and boy sat near the back, wrapped in blankets. The boy's cheeks were hollow. His eyes were too old for his face. The woman introduced herself to Daryl as Megan. The boy was Lucas. They did not talk much after that. Daryl introduced me to their radio guy, a man named Victor who had been an amateur radio hobbyist before the outbreak. He had a small antenna setup rigged between trees, with coaxial cable running into a shelter where he kept a radio transceiver and a car battery bank. He was proud of it. He should have been. It worked. But the battery setup was rough. Cables were thin. Connections were corroding. They were charging the battery bank with a small gasoline generator that ran loud and stank and forced them to choose between power and stealth. When Victor showed me the setup, he said, "We keep the generator run short, 10 minutes twice a day. Any longer and the infected start drifting this way." The sentence told me the camp's real vulnerability. Noise. Noise draws infected. Noise also draws scavengers. Noise also draws desperate people. Noise is the tax you pay for modern power. That night, I did not sleep much. I listened to the camp breathe. I listened to the wind in the trees. I listened for infected movement beyond the clearing. I also listened to the human noises, a cough, a quiet argument, a child's sniffle. The next morning, Daryl put me to work immediately. "Help Victor with the power," he said. "If you can make it quieter, make it quieter. If you can make it safer, make it safer." I nodded. I did not need more explanation. That was my language. We started with the basics. We cleaned battery terminals with a wire brush and baking soda paste to neutralize corrosion. We replaced thin cables with thicker ones, scavenged from a junked vehicle, because current capacity matters. Thin cables heat up and waste power. They also fail at the worst time. We improved the solar setup by moving panels to a better angle and adding a simple frame so wind would not flip them. A solar panel cracked by wind is dead weight. We added a fuse to the main battery line using an automotive fuse block. Fuses prevent fires. Fires in camps spread fast. Victor watched closely, sometimes defensive, sometimes grateful. At one point he said, "You sure you do not want to transmit? We got a list of frequencies we call on." I shook my head. "Listening first," I said. "Transmitting later if needed." He smiled slightly. "You are cautious." "I am alive," I said. Over the next days, I learned the camp's rhythm. They sent scavenging teams into town on alternating days. Small groups of 2 or 3, never the same route twice. They avoided the square whenever possible. They moved along back alleys and used the creek bed as a hidden corridor. Megan did not go on runs yet. Lucas stayed close to her. He helped with small tasks, carrying water, sorting supplies, cleaning cookware. I kept my distance at first. I did not want to pry. But one afternoon, while I was repairing a torn tarp seam with heavy thread and a curved needle, Megan approached. She stood a few feet away and said, "You were in the tower." It was not a question. "Yes," I said. "You watched," she said. "Yes," I said again. She stared at the ground for a moment, then said, "Why did you not help him?" There it was. The question that had been living in my chest since that day. I did not pretend not to understand. "The noise drew too many," I said. "If I had come down and tried to fight, it would have pulled more in. The tower would have been compromised. Then there would have been no safe place at all." She looked up, eyes sharp. "Safe for you." I felt the sting and did not deny it. "Yes," I said. "Safe for me." She held my gaze for a long moment. Then her shoulders sagged. "He was my brother," she said, voice flat. "Drew said the church would hold. He said he had done this before. He said we just needed a building with one entrance." I did not speak. She continued. "He kept shouting. I told him to stop. He would not. He thought if he sounded confident, Lucas would not panic." Her mouth tightened. All it did was bring them faster. She turned her head slightly toward Lucas, who was sitting near the fire pit area, quietly sharpening a pencil with a pocket knife. "He is not my son," she said. "Lucas is Drew's boy." She swallowed. "Drew is gone. So now Lucas is mine." I nodded slowly. "I left water by the door," she said. "Was that you?" "Yes." Her eyes narrowed slightly. "Why?" That was the question with a better answer. "Because I could," I said. "Because I did not want you to go out there for it. Because I did not want the kid to die of thirst in a church." She stared at me for a long moment. Then she said, "Thank you." And she walked away. That was the first time I felt like I had done something right since I climbed into the tower. A week later, the tower nearly got me killed even from miles away. It started with sound. Late afternoon, clear sky, cold air that carried noise well. We heard something faint from the direction of town, a bell. Not the church bell, ringing properly, not a clean single note. It was a heavy clanging, irregular, like metal striking metal. It rang once, then again, then stopped, then rang again. Every person in camp froze. Daryl's face tightened. Victor said, "That is coming from the church." My stomach dropped. There was no one in that tower except the bell. And the bell should not have been moving. Daryl grabbed his rifle and motioned for 2 others. "We are not going in," he said. "We are getting eyes." He looked at me. "You know that tower better than anyone. What could make it ring?" Wind, I thought. Structural shift, someone pulling on the bell, someone climbing. I said, If someone is in there and hits the bell frame with a tool, it will ring. If the bell swings, that is worse. That means someone is pulling the yoke or the bell itself. Victor's eyes widened. Why would anyone do that? Daryl answered for him. Because they want every infected in town to go there. Because they want to clear streets, or because they want to draw us in. I felt cold spread under my ribs. A trap. We moved to a vantage point on the ridge where we could see the town through binoculars. From there, the church was visible as a dark shape against pale buildings. The tower stood out. And there was movement. A figure at the tower opening. A person leaning out doing something with their arms. Then the bell clanged again, louder, and I saw infected movement in the square immediately. They started converging like a swarm. They poured in from side streets. The figure in the tower withdrew from view. Daryl lowered the binoculars. "That is not an accident," he said. He looked at me. "Did you leave anything up there? Anything someone would want?" I thought fast. Not much. I had stripped it when I left. But there was still my platform, my barriers. There might have been small scraps I missed. A bottle, a piece of cord. Nothing worth ringing a bell for. Unless the point was not the tower itself. Unless the point was to move the infected. Someone was using my old shelter as a tool. Daryl made a decision quickly, the way people who kept roads open make decisions in storms. "We do not go," he said. "We watch. If they are clearing the square, they might be moving toward the gas station and the main road. They might be trying to get out with a vehicle." He turned to the others. "We set a lookout on the back road. If anyone runs this way, we intercept before they get close enough to see camp." My heart pounded, but my head stayed clear. "Whoever is in that tower knows what they are doing," I said. "They found a way to use sound to move infected. That is skill." Daryl nodded grimly. Skill or desperation. We watched for an hour. Eventually we saw it. A small convoy, 2 vehicles moving fast down Main Street. One was a pickup with a light bar. The other was a boxy van. They were driving aggressively, bumping over curbs, avoiding abandoned cars. They were using the bell as a diversion to pull infected away from their route. It worked, mostly. But infected do not stay redirected for long. Some broke off and chased. Others poured out of buildings at the sound of engines. The convoy made it out of town, heading toward the highway. Daryl tracked them with binoculars until the trees blocked the view. Then he lowered the binoculars and said, "Now the infected will spread outward. They are stirred up." He looked around the ridgeline. Everyone tightens up. No generator tonight, no open fire. We keep light down. That night, I lay awake thinking about the tower again, not as a shelter, but as a symbol. It had kept me alive because I was invisible. Now, someone had made it loud. In the new world, anything loud becomes a problem for everyone around it. 2 days later, the problem walked into our camp's orbit. A stranger appeared at the edge of the clearing at midday, hands up, moving slow. He was alone. He wore a black rain jacket and carried a pack that looked heavy. His hair was shaved close, and he had the kind of calm face that can be either disciplined or empty. Daryl stepped forward, rifle down but ready. The man said, "I'm looking for a place to rest." Daryl asked the same questions he asked me: bites, injuries, skills. The man said, "No bites, no injuries, I can fix cars, I can shoot." Daryl's face stayed neutral. "What is your name?" Daryl asked. The man hesitated just a fraction, then said, "Cal." Something about that hesitation made my skin tighten. Names are easy. People hesitate when they are lying or when they are deciding what version of themselves to present. Daryl said, "We do not take people lightly." Cal nodded. "I get it." He glanced past Daryl into camp, eyes scanning quickly, counting, evaluating. Then his eyes landed on me. He stared just a little too long, like he recognized something. I stayed still. Cal smiled faintly. "You are the tower guy," he said. My chest went cold. Daryl's head turned toward me. "What is he talking about?" Cal kept smiling. "Church bell tower, town square. Clever setup. Barriers on the stairs, platform in the bell chamber. Someone lived there." I did not speak. Daryl's voice hardened. "How do you know that?" Cal shrugged. "I climbed it 2 days ago." Victor swore under his breath. Megan pulled Lucas behind her. Daryl stepped closer to Cal. "Why did you ring the bell?" Cal's smile widened slightly. "Because it works." Daryl's jaw tightened. "Why ring it where we can hear it?" Cal's eyes flicked over Daryl's shoulder again. "Maybe because I wanted to see who paid attention." Silence settled over the clearing like a weight. I saw the shape of the situation clearly. Cal was not just a drifter. He was a test. He had used the bell to move infected and clear a route for his convoy. He had likely been with the group that drove out of town. Now he was here, alone, either separated or sent ahead. And he had found us. Daryl spoke slowly. "You came here on purpose." Cal held his hands up a little higher. "I followed the ridge smoke, same as anyone." Daryl did not blink. "We have been careful with smoke." Cal's smile did not change. "Careful is not invisible." That line felt like a threat wrapped in casual words. Daryl looked at 2 of his people, subtle signals. They shifted positions slightly, giving themselves angles. Daryl said, "We are not taking you in." Cal nodded once, as if he expected it. "Okay," he said. "Then I will rest out there." He gestured toward the woods. "And I will remember where you are." Daryl's voice went colder. "If you bring people here, you bring infected here." Cal shrugged. "That is your problem, not mine." Daryl took a step forward. "No, that becomes everyone's problem." Cal's eyes narrowed for the first time. "You going to do something about it?" Daryl stared at him for a long moment. Then Daryl said, "Leave. Now. Go the way you came. If we see you again, we will assume you are a threat." Cal's smile vanished. He looked at me again, and his eyes held a message. "You know what I can do with sound." Then he turned and walked away slowly, hands still visible, disappearing into the trees. No one spoke for a full minute after he left. Then Victor said, "He's going to bring people." Daryl nodded. "Yes." Megan said, "Or he is going to bring infected." Daryl nodded again. "Yes." Everyone looked at me then, because I was the one with the tower, the one who understood what a controlled noise could do. Daryl said, "Aaron, we need to move." The camp had always been temporary. Every camp is. The only question is whether you leave on your terms or because someone forces you. Daryl called a meeting that afternoon. They had a plan already in pieces. A larger shelter location farther along the ridge, near an old quarry site with a fenced perimeter and a water source. It was farther from town, farther from roads, harder to reach. The problem was getting there with the supplies, with Lucas, with people who could not move fast. And the bigger problem was whether Cal's convoy was already moving. We had maybe a day, 2 at most. We packed with speed, but not panic. That was Daryl's strength. He kept people moving without making them loud. We broke down tarps and rolled them tight, we loaded vehicles only with what mattered: food, water containers, medical supplies, tools, radio gear, batteries, fuel. We buried what we could not carry in sealed containers marked with hidden signs only we would understand. That is an old trick, and it still works if you are disciplined. At dawn, we left Ridge Camp. I walked in the second group, on foot, keeping pace with Megan and Lucas. Lucas carried a smaller pack now, balanced, straps tightened so it would not bounce. Megan held his hand when terrain got steep. We moved along a ridge trail that followed old logging cuts and utility right-of-ways. Sometimes we crossed open areas where you could see the valley and the town far below, like a model. Sometimes we moved through dense trees where the world narrowed to bark and breath. We did not use the generator. We did not speak loudly. We did not stop long. Midday, we heard engines. Faint at first, then stronger. Daryl signaled everyone to drop and hold. We crouched behind rocks and brush and listened. The engines were coming from the direction of the town road, moving along the valley. A convoy. More than 2 vehicles this time. We could not see them through trees, but we could hear the Doppler shift as they moved. Closer, then passing, then fading. Then we heard something worse, not gunfire, not screaming. A long, rising chorus of infected noise, distant but growing. They were being pulled, drawn, moved. Cal was doing it again. He was using sound, vehicles, and chaos to flush infected out of town and push them outward like a wave. He was either clearing routes for his group or deliberately destabilizing the area so no one else could settle. Either way, he was a moving storm. Daryl's eyes met mine across the brush. He did not need to speak. The message was simple. Keep moving, stay unseen. We resumed the march. By late afternoon, we reached the quarry. It was an old limestone cut with steep walls on one side and a chain-link fence on the other. The fence was partially down in places, but the geography itself created a natural barrier. There was a small pond at the base, fed by groundwater seepage, cold and clear enough to be workable with filtration. There was also a service building, concrete block with a metal roll-up door that had been forced open long ago. Inside was space, dry enough and strong enough to fortify. We set up quickly. Daryl posted watches at high points. We used the fence as a first line, repaired sections with wire and scavenged panels. We dragged old equipment parts, rusted conveyor rollers, heavy steel frames, into positions that blocked vehicle access. We built the new camp like my tower. Controlled access, controlled noise, controlled lines of sight. That night, as people settled into exhausted sleep, Daryl sat with me near the service building entrance. He spoke quietly. "You ever think about ringing that bell yourself?" I looked at him. "To pull infected away?" He nodded. I considered it. In theory, controlled noise could be used as a tool, a diversion, a way to clear a path. But every time you ring a bell, you tell the world you exist. And people like Cal listen. "I think about it," I admitted. "But it is a short-term move with long-term cost." Daryl nodded. "That is what I thought." He leaned back against the concrete wall and stared at the dark trees. "We are not going to be able to avoid people forever," he said. "No," I agreed. He exhaled slowly. "When that happens, I want us to be ready." I understood what he meant. Ready did not mean eager. It meant structured. It meant disciplined. It meant not getting pulled into someone else's chaos. In the weeks that followed, Cal did not appear again. But the consequences of his bell did. Infected movement patterns changed. Where the town had once held them like a basin, Now they drifted outward along roads, trails, and creek beds. We saw more of them in the woods. We heard them at night sometimes, their sounds bouncing off quarry walls like distant echoes. We adapted. We kept noise down. We used hand tools more than power tools. We cooked with minimal smoke. We shifted watch rotations. We kept the radio receiver on low volume and listened more than we talked. Victor picked up a transmission one evening, faint and broken. A voice on a general calling frequency saying the same phrase every minute like a beacon. Safe zone, medical, food. If you are out there, respond. It could have been real. It could have been a trap. We listened for days without responding. That was the new world. Every signal might be a lifeline or a lure. One night, Megan sat beside me on a crate near the pond, watching Lucas skip stones with careful focus. She said, "You missed the tower." I looked at the quarry wall, high and dark. "I miss knowing that no one could come up without me hearing," I said. She nodded. "But you left it." "Yes." "Why?" she asked. I thought about the bell, about the day I watched and did not move, about the water bottle, about Lucas. "Because being unseen is not the same as being safe," I said. "It is just quieter." Megan stared at the pond for a long moment. Then she said, "Drew always thought noise meant control, like if he talked loud enough the world would listen." I swallowed. "Cal thinks noise means control too," she said. "Yes," I said. She looked at Lucas. "Lucas thinks quiet means control." I watched the boy's small hand flick a stone. It skipped 3 times and sank. "He might be right," I said. Megan nodded once. Then she stood and walked back toward the shelter, and I sat there by the cold water and listened to the night. In the distance, far beyond the ridge, the town's church bell did not ring anymore. It stood over an empty square, stone walls cracked but still standing, a piece of the old world that had become a tool in the new one. I had lived inside it like a shadow. Someone else had turned it into a signal. Now I understood the truth I had been avoiding. Survival was not just about where you hide. It was about what you choose to become while you are hidden. And it was about what you do when someone else rings the bell. Thanks for listening. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like and subscribe. Your support keeps these creepypastas coming. Until next time, stay alert, stay safe, and never ignore the feeling that something is watching.